Okay, so our first story for Biblical Illusions is the creation of the world, which makes sense, obviously. So in Genesis 1:1, it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." It says later in John that actually Jesus and the Spirit were with him at this point. And it actually mentions the Spirit in Genesis 1, but that's, could be important. Anyway, so back to Genesis. On the first day, God created day. Makes sense, right? He separated light and the dark, and he created night and day. And so then on the second day, he created waters in the sky. Waters, of course, refers to really it's just water because there's no land yet. And that comes on the third day. On the third day, he creates land because he separates the waters and also the vegetation that goes along with land. So the land and the trees and, all the normal stuff. On the fourth day, he creates the sun, moon, and the stars. They're called the lights of the sky, and they're supposed to govern the day and night. And on the fifth day, he creates sea creatures and birds, which is pretty straightforward. And then on the sixth day, he creates land creatures, and he actually creates man. God says that he gives all the land creatures and all the earth to man. And finally, on the seventh day, God rested, and this became the Sabbath, which is the holy, Sunday for the Jews. So the next story is Adam and Eve, and this one, in order to kind of go back to the sixth day of creation, God formed man from the dust of the ground, and he named him Adam. And he actually basically put him in this garden called the Garden of Eden. I'm sure y'all have all heard of it. That was basically a paradise. He was able to walk with God. And besides that, after he formed Adam, he decided that he needed a partner. He needed somebody to keep him company in the Garden of Eden. So he took a rib from his side and from it created woman. So in the Garden of Eden, all of the land creatures have been made, of course, obviously. And there was this one tree that God told the man and woman, Adam and Eve, that they were not supposed to eat from. And we always kind of call it an apple tree. Well, it's not specifically an apple tree, but that's basically, you can think of it as an apple tree. So he told them, you can't eat from this tree. Well, the serpent was supposedly the craftiest animal, and the serpent is really supposed to be the devil in disguise. And the serpent goes up to Eve one day and basically says, hey, why don't you go ahead and take some of that fruit from the tree? And she said, well, I'm not allowed. And he basically tells her, well, God won't allow you to do that because when you eat it, you'll be smart and you'll gain all sorts of wisdom. And so she's kind of like, oh, okay. And so she goes ahead and takes a bite from the fruit. And she gives it to her husband, Adam, and she says, go ahead and eat some of this fruit. And so he eats it too. And they both realize that they're naked. Because before they ate the fruit, they were supposedly innocent. They didn't know anything about the world. Well, when they ate it, they suddenly were aware of sin and so on, and they realized they were naked, so they try to cover themselves up. So God comes into the Garden of Eden, and he calls for them. Well, they were hiding behind a bush, and they had covered themselves in fig leaves. And God says, where are you? And they step out, and he says, basically, why have you covered yourself up? Well, eventually they admit that they had eaten from the forbidden tree, and that Satan had basically tricked them into doing so. And so eventually, God decides to punish them and says basically, well, now, congratulations, you've introduced sin into the world. And that was basically the fall of man and the reason that we experience pain and death and so on. And so that was basically man's fall from innocence, and also the reason that we don't live in a utopia. And so that is the story of Adam and Eve. Okay, so the next story is Abraham and Isaac. So Abraham had great faith, and because of this, God promised to him that he would be the father of many nations. Well, this didn't make any sense because at the time that he promised this to Abraham, Abraham's wife Sarah was barren, and they were both pretty old, so they weren't, about to have children anytime soon. And so, they didn't really believe. Even, despite the fact that Abraham supposedly has such great faith, they both doubted. But despite their doubts, God actually blessed them with a son, and they named him Isaac, which actually means he laughs, because they supposedly laughed when somebody told them that they were going to have a baby. Anyway, so besides that, when Isaac got to be older, like a teenager, God told Abraham to go and actually sacrifice Isaac on an altar on a mountain. And so Abraham doesn't question it, despite how crazy that sounds. He goes ahead and tells Isaac, okay, we're going to this mountain. And so they go to the mountain and they build the altar. Well, in the middle of building the altar, Isaac is like, hey, Dad, like, where's our animal? And Abraham actually says, oh, don't worry about it, Isaac. God will provide an animal. Well, later, eventually, when they finish building the altar, Abraham actually has Isaac on the altar. I guess he must have been pretty strong, because Isaac, I guess, couldn't put up a good enough fight. But anyway, so while he's about to sacrifice his own son to God, God says, hold up, Abraham, don't do it. And Abraham's like, what? And he says, this was basically a test, and you passed. He said, now I know that you have great faith. And so he basically said, look in the bushes or whatever. And then apparently there was this ram caught in the bushes, and so they sacrificed the ram instead. So this is kind of the important part about Abraham and Isaac, is this is like a very early parallel to the story of Jesus, because God sacrificed his one and only son. Basically, obviously there's key differences. Jesus actually died, but anyway, that's the significance of Abraham and Isaac. Okay, so the next story is the Tower of Babel. So after the Great Flood, which means the flood with Noah's Ark and all that, if you're familiar with that story, everybody spoke one language. Everybody in the entire world spoke one language. And so they all got together. They started like settling in like Babylonia and those kind of places, if you know where that is, somewhere in the east. And since they all spoke one language, they were like, hey, like, let's build a tower that's so tall that it reaches heaven. And basically it was an exhibition of pride and a desire for glory and power. Well, God didn't like that. And so he said, just kidding. No, you're not. I'm going to mix up every language that you speak. And so they couldn't understand each other. He basically made one of them speak one language and one of them speak another one they couldn't build the tower because they couldn't talk to one another. And so they basically gave up and they said, okay, forget it. And they all just kind of left and settled in their own places. So basically this is the Bible's story of how different languages came into being. And that's the Tower of Babel. So Jonah and the whale. Jonah was a prophet, right? And God calls him to Nineveh. Well, Nineveh was like a really bad place. It was like the ghetto of the biblical world. And so Jonah was like, I don't want to go there. And so he decides to flee God's calling and go to a place called Tarshish instead. So he's on this boat to go to Tarshish, and this great storm comes and like starts rocking the boat, and all the sailors on the boat are afraid that they're about to die. So what they do is they cast lots, which basically means like it's like the biblical version of like drawing sticks or whatever, and there's like a different version with stones. And it's like if you get the shortest stick, like you're the one responsible, it's your fault. Well, so they do this, and Jonah was the one that got the shortest stick or whatever, and so they decided that it was him that did it. And so they were like, what in the world did you do to make your God so angry? And so Jonah admitted to them that he was basically running away from going to Nineveh. And so they tried to not, they didn't want to throw him in the ocean or anything, but he told them, you know what, just go ahead and throw me in the ocean. Save yourselves. Well, eventually they felt like they had no other choice, and so they went ahead and did it. And so Jonah was thrown in the ocean, and this huge whale, really it's a great fish, those are the words in the Bible, but you can think of it as a whale, swallowed him. And so he stayed in the whale's belly for 3 days and 3 nights, and while he was there he prayed. he prayed for forgiveness, and he basically asked God to come and save him in his time of need. And so God told the whale to spit him out, and so the whale spit him out on dry land. And Jonah, this time, said, okay, I don't want to get in, end up in a whale's stomach again. So he actually went to Nineveh this time. And while he was at Nineveh, he actually convinced the king and all the people to turn from their bad ways, and so they stopped being ghetto, and they started to worship God, and they became more of a righteous people. And so, happy ending to Jonah and the whale. Alright, so the next story is Samson and Delilah. So Samson was born a Nazarite, which means that he was basically set apart for God to be special. He was supposed to have great faith. He wasn't supposed to drink any alcohol. He was never supposed to cut his hair, and that'll be important later. And there's several other requirements that he had to live by in order to stay a Nazarite and be the elite of God. And so he grew up to have incredible strength. He was known to strangle lions and such. And so eventually he became actually the ruler of Israel, and this is the time when the Philistines were in control of the Israelites, which happened periodically, but the Philistines and Israelites didn't get along. And that's important because at one point he was married, but he then had a feud with the Israelites, the Philistines. And the Philistines actually killed one of their own, because his wife was a Philistine. And they actually killed her because he had a feud with them. Anyway, so he is unmarried, and he's a widow, and he falls in love with this woman named Delilah. Well, the Philistines go up to Delilah, and they're like, okay, figure out his weakness, and then tell us so that we can kill him. Hint, hint, and they give her a bunch of gold, right, and they pay her to do it. And so she starts to ask him how he can be subdued because he's incredibly strong. And 3 times she asked him, but he would lie to her. He kept lying to her. He told her first oh, if you tie me up with bowstrings, then I'll be just as weak as any other man, or oh, if you tie me up with this sort of cord or whatever. Well, on the 4th time, she basically pulled the whole love card, why don't you love me? If you loved me, you would tell me. And so he finally admitted to her, if you cut my hair, I'll be as weak as any other man. And so she cut his hair and let the Philistines ambush him. And so they shackled him and took him away, and basically made fun of him in one of their little buildings or whatever, one of their temples, I think. And so eventually, while they had him in captivity, he, of course, his hair started growing back. And at one point, they had him out in the midst of these pillars in this temple, and he prayed to God to remember him one last time, and he grabbed the pillars and brought them down on all the Philistines and himself. So he killed a bunch of the Philistines, but he also killed himself at the same time. So, sad story, but that's Samson and Delilah.